There is a map on the wall of every energy war room in the world. It shows the arteries of global oil, the pipelines, the shipping lanes, the choke points where the entire modern economy can be strangled with a single blockade. For 50 years, one artery mattered more than all the others combined. The Strait of Hormuz, 20 miles wide, 40 feet deep in the shipping channel, and through that sliver of water between Iran and Oman, 1/5 of every barrel of oil consumed on this planet passed every single day. This morning, that artery stopped pumping. And the moment it stopped, the moment 200 tankers went motionless, the moment insurance companies pulled coverage, the moment explosions lit the sky over the Persian Gulf and fighter jets screamed over crews trapped on ships carrying millions of barrels of crude that cannot move, something else happened, something that most people have not yet understood, something that changes the energy map permanently. The world looked up from the chaos in the Gulf and realized that one country, one single country, had spent years quietly building an entirely different route, a route that does not pass through the Strait of Hormuz, a route that does not cross the Red Sea, a route that does not touch a single conflict zone, a single contested waterway, a single choke point where a war can turn the lights off. That country is Canada. And if you live in the United States and you are about to pay record prices at the gas pump, you need to understand something that your government does not want you to think about too carefully. The country that controls whether your fuel prices spike or stabilize, the country that sits on 163 billion barrels of proven crude reserves, the country that just built the infrastructure to ship that oil anywhere on Earth, that country is the same country that the United States has spent the last 2 months threatening, tariffing, and treating like a subordinate. Canada does not just have oil. Canada has the only oil that can move. And in a world where the Strait of Hormuz is closed, the only oil that can move is the only oil that matters. In this breakdown, I am going to walk you through exactly what happened in the Strait of Hormuz, why it shut down, and why it is not reopening anytime soon. I am going to show you the 4 receipts that prove Canada spent years preparing for exactly this moment while the United States was too busy picking fights to notice. I am going to reveal the specific countries that are already lining up to buy Canadian energy and why each new contract makes American leverage over Canada weaker. I am going to explain how the Strait of Hormuz crisis connects directly to the U.S.-Canada trade war and why Trump's tariff policy just became the most expensive strategic miscalculation in modern American history. And I'm going to give you 3 scenarios for what gas prices, energy security, and the U.S.-Canada power dynamic look like 6 months from now. Subscribe to join the community, leave a comment so we can keep the conversation going, and share this video because what you are about to learn will not be covered with this level of clarity anywhere else. Let me start with what happened in the Strait, because you need to understand the scale of this disruption before you can understand why Canada's position is so powerful. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a shipping lane. It is the jugular vein of the global economy. Under normal conditions, roughly 100 tankers pass through that corridor every single day. They carry crude oil from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, and Qatar toward refineries in Asia, Europe, and North America. 1/5 of the entire world's oil supply, 1/5, through a passage narrower than the width of Manhattan. When the conflict surrounding Iran intensified and military operations escalated, that passage did not slow down. It stopped. Commercial shipping companies began pulling vessels. Insurance companies, the invisible hand that makes global trade possible, raised premiums so high that voyages became financially impossible and then withdrew coverage entirely. Naval tensions pushed every remaining commercial ship away from the region. The result is an eerie, terrifying silence where there used to be the constant churn of the world's most important trade route. According to maritime data from Lloyd's List, approximately 200 tankers are now trapped in the Strait and surrounding Gulf waters. 200 ships, each one carrying millions of barrels of crude oil, motionless, anchored near the coast of Dubai, scattered throughout the Gulf, crewed by thousands of seafarers from India, the Philippines, and dozens of other countries who are stuck in the middle of a war zone with limited communication, rationed food, and no timeline for when they can leave. One crew member aboard a crude tanker described the moment the crisis began. Orders came to stop loading cargo after explosions lit the sky in the distance. Then hours later, contradictory orders arrived to resume loading despite the chaos. The tanker eventually filled with more than 1 million barrels of crude while GPS signals disappeared, satellite communications failed, and military aircraft roared overhead. That crew member is still on that ship. 20 seafarers, 60 days of food and water if they ration carefully, explosions flashing across the sky at night, fighter jets during the day, and 1 million barrels of oil that nobody can deliver to anyone. 6 vessels have been attacked, 2 seafarers have died, and the International Transport Workers Federation, representing 1.2 million maritime workers, is receiving urgent messages from sailors begging for evacuation from a region that ship owners have declared a no-go zone. This is not a temporary disruption. This is not a weather delay. This is the most important energy choke point on Earth going offline with no clear timeline for reopening. And every day it remains closed. The pressure on global oil markets intensifies. Prices climb higher, and the countries that depend on Gulf oil face a choice that gets more desperate by the hour. Find a new supplier, or watch the lights go out. Now let me show you why Canada's position in this crisis is not just strong, it is historically unprecedented, because what Canada built over the past several years is not just an alternative supply route, it is the only alternative supply route. And the difference between having alternatives and being the only alternative is the difference between leverage and absolute power. Receipt number 1, the pipeline they said would never matter. For years, the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion was dismissed by critics as unnecessary, environmentally reckless, and economically unjustifiable. The argument was simple. Canada sells its oil to the United States through pipelines flowing south, and that arrangement works fine. Why spend billions building a route to the Pacific coast when your customer is right next door? That argument assumed 2 things. First, that the United States would always be a reliable and fair customer. Second, that global shipping routes would always function normally. Both assumptions just died. The Trans Mountain expansion now transports approximately 890,000 barrels of crude oil per day from Alberta's oil sands to shipping terminals on Canada's Pacific coast. From those terminals, tankers can reach Asian markets in roughly 10 days. That is half the transit time required for Middle Eastern cargo traveling the traditional route through the Strait of Hormuz, when the strait is open. Right now, the strait is not open. Right now, Middle Eastern cargo is not traveling anywhere. That means Canadian oil is not just cheaper to ship than Middle Eastern oil. It is the only oil available for shipment to Asia's largest economies. There is no competition. There is no alternative to the alternative. Canada built a route that bypasses every choke point, avoids every conflict zone, and delivers crude to the fastest growing energy markets on Earth through waters where the only threat is weather, not warfare. Within a single year of the pipeline expansion opening, non-American exports of Canadian crude increased by 289%. Not a typo, 289%. China alone purchased approximately 100 million barrels of Canadian oil during an 11-month period as tankers began arriving at Pacific terminals with increasing frequency. The critics said the pipeline would never matter. The Strait of Hormuz just made it the most important piece of energy infrastructure on the planet. Receipt number 2, the $40 billion bet that just paid off. LNG Canada, a liquefied natural gas terminal on the coast of British Columbia, the largest private investment in Canadian history at $40 billion. First cargo already shipped. Operations underway. Capacity to support roughly 170 tanker shipments per year at full output. When this facility was under construction, skeptics questioned whether there would be enough demand to justify the investment. Asian LNG markets were well supplied by Qatar, Australia, and the United States. Why would buyers pay for Canadian gas when they already had reliable sources? Here is why. Qatar's LNG tankers travel through the Strait of Hormuz. They are not moving right now. U.S. LNG exports compete with domestic demand and are subject to the political whims of an administration that has demonstrated it will weaponize energy policy for political leverage. Australian LNG faces its own capacity constraints and geographic limitations. Canadian LNG travels from British Columbia across the open Pacific. No choke points, no conflict zones, no political games, clean route, reliable supply, democratic country with transparent regulations and enforceable contracts. South Korea already purchases Canadian LNG from the facility. That contract, signed before the Strait crisis, now looks like one of the most strategically brilliant energy decisions any country has made in the past decade. While other Asian nations scramble to secure gas supplies, South Korea has a direct pipeline, figuratively and literally, to Canadian natural gas that does not depend on a single waterway remaining open. The $40 billion investment that skeptics questioned just became worth multiples of that in strategic value. Because it is not just a terminal, it is a lifeline. And right now, the world has very few lifelines available. Receipt number 3, the reserves that dwarf the crisis. Let me give you the numbers because the numbers tell you everything about why Canada's position is unassailable. Canadian proven oil reserves total approximately 163 billion barrels. That places Canada 4th in the world, behind Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. But Venezuela's oil industry is crippled by mismanagement and sanctions. Saudi Arabia's exports are trapped behind the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran is at the center of the conflict that closed the strait in the first place, which means the 3 countries with larger reserves than Canada either cannot export or are the reason exports have stopped. Canada is the largest holder of accessible, exportable, conflict-free oil reserves on the planet. Production levels approach 6 million barrels per day when counting conventional oil, alongside output from Alberta's massive oil sands operations. That is not theoretical capacity. That is current production. Barrels coming out of the ground today, flowing through pipelines today, loading onto tankers today. And it is not just oil. Canada produces natural gas, liquefied natural gas, and uranium, the full spectrum of energy resources that the modern world runs on, all produced in a stable, democratic country, all exported through routes that avoid every global conflict zone. Few nations can claim that combination, and right now, no nation can match it. Receipt number 4. The buyers are already lined up. This is where the crisis transforms from a commodity disruption into a geopolitical realignment, because the countries showing up at Canada's door are not browsing. They are desperate. India, 1.4 billion people, imports roughly 90% of its oil, previously relied heavily on shipments passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Current emergency reserves, fewer than 10 days. Fewer than 10 days. A country of 1.4 billion people has less than 2 weeks of fuel before its economy begins shutting down. Factories close, transportation stops, power generation falters, social stability erodes. During recent diplomatic conversations, an Indian official reportedly told Canadian representatives, India will purchase whatever Canada is offering. Whatever Canada is offering. That is not a negotiating position. That is a country standing at the edge of an energy cliff and grabbing the only rope it can see. Japan faces similar exposure. The island nation imports nearly all of its energy. Maritime routes through the Strait of Hormuz were the primary supply line. Those routes are closed. Japan's industrial economy, the 3rd largest in the world, depends on finding alternative supply immediately. South Korea, already purchasing Canadian LNG, is now seeking to expand those contracts dramatically. Europe, which spent years reducing dependence on Russian gas and believed Middle Eastern supplies were the safe alternative, is watching that assumption collapse in real time. Every one of these countries represents billions of dollars in long-term energy contracts. Every contract signed is a relationship that does not include the United States. Every relationship that does not include the United States is leverage that Canada holds and America does not. And here is the detail that should keep the White House up at night. India's emerging uranium agreement with Saskatchewan producers covers roughly 10 years of supply worth approximately $2.8 billion. That is not an emergency purchase. That is a decade-long strategic partnership. Canada is not just filling a gap. Canada is building permanent relationships with the world's largest energy consumers. Relationships that will outlast this crisis, outlast the strait closure, and outlast any American administration. Now, let me connect this directly to the U.S.-Canada crisis because the connection is not incidental. It is causal. 18 months ago, Canada sold the overwhelming majority of its crude oil to the United States. Pipelines flowed south. American refineries were the primary customer. Canadian producers had limited options for selling their supply, which meant they had limited leverage over pricing. The result was that Canadian crude regularly sold at enormous discounts to global benchmarks, sometimes $40 to $60 less per barrel than international prices. Middle Eastern producers typically sold at discounts of $10 or less, but Canadian producers, locked into a single customer relationship with the United States, accepted discounts 4 to 6 times larger because they had nowhere else to go. American refineries benefited enormously. They were buying world-class crude at bargain basement prices because Canada had no alternative buyer. That arrangement was not a partnership. It was a dependency trap, and the United States used that dependency as leverage in every negotiation, every trade discussion, every political confrontation. Canada needed American markets. America knew it, and America priced accordingly. Then 2 things happened simultaneously. First, Canada built alternative export infrastructure, the Trans Mountain expansion, LNG Canada, Pacific Coast terminals, routes to Asia that did not exist before. Second, the United States imposed tariffs on Canadian goods, threatened Canadian sovereignty, and treated Canada as a subordinate rather than a partner. The first development gave Canada the ability to diversify. The second gave Canada the motivation. And together, they produce the situation that exists right now, a situation in which Canada has the infrastructure to sell energy to the entire world and has every reason to prioritize buyers who treat Canada with respect over a buyer who threatens to turn Canada into an economic wasteland. Trump's tariff policy did not just damage the trade relationship. It accelerated Canada's pivot away from American markets at the exact moment when a global crisis made that pivot astronomically valuable. When benchmark oil prices climbed toward $100 per barrel because the Strait of Hormuz is closed, Canadian crude no longer sells at a $40 discount. Canadian crude sells at or near global prices because it is one of the few large supplies that can actually reach buyers. The discount that American refineries enjoyed for decades, the discount built on Canadian dependency, evaporates overnight. American refineries that were paying $55 for Canadian crude are now competing with Indian, Japanese, Korean, and European buyers willing to pay $95 or more. And why would Canada sell to the country that imposed illegal tariffs and threatened to destroy its economy when it can sell to countries that are offering premium prices and long-term commitments? Every barrel that flows west to Asia instead of south to America is a barrel that American refineries must replace from more expensive sources. Every barrel replaced from more expensive sources increases the cost of gasoline at every American pump. Every cent added at the pump is a direct, measurable, unavoidable consequence of a trade policy that pushed Canada to build the very alternatives that are now draining supply away from the American market. You are going to pay more for gas. You are going to pay more for heating oil. You are going to pay more for electricity. And the reason is not the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz created the global shortage. But the reason you are paying more than you should is that the President of the United States spent 2 months attacking the country that was America's cheapest, closest, most reliable energy supplier. And that country responded by building the infrastructure to sell its energy to everyone else. Trump did not just lose Canada as an ally, he lost Canada as a discount supplier. And in a world where the Strait of Hormuz is closed, that discount was worth more than every tariff he imposed combined. Now, let me give you the economic consequences in detail because the numbers are about to become very personal. Alberta's oil sands industry alone employs more than 150,000 people directly. Hundreds of thousands more work in the supply chain, equipment manufacturing, transportation, engineering services. Rising global oil prices increase royalty payments to provincial governments, expand investment across communities, and strengthen Canada's fiscal position at the exact moment when the United States is facing the opposite trajectory. For American consumers, the math is brutal. When Canadian crude was flowing predominantly to U.S. refineries at a $40 discount, that discount translated into lower gasoline prices across the Midwest and Pacific Northwest. Refineries in those regions were designed to process Canadian heavy crude. They are optimized for it. They depend on it. When that supply is redirected to Asia, when those tankers turn left at British Columbia instead of right toward the U.S., those refineries face two choices: source replacement crude from more expensive, more distant suppliers, or reduce output. Either choice raises prices. The first adds transportation costs and eliminates the discount. The second reduces supply in a market already strained by the strait closure. Either way, American gasoline prices climb. Industry analysts estimate that the combination of the Strait of Hormuz closure and the reduction in Canadian crude flowing to U.S. markets will add between 0.85 and 140 per gallon to American gasoline prices within 60 days, on top of prices that are already elevated from the tariff-related disruptions of the past 2 months. That is not a number on a spreadsheet. That is the number on the pump when you fill your car tomorrow and next week and next month. That is the number that determines whether you can afford the commute to work, whether you can heat your home, whether the trucking company that delivers food to your grocery store can afford to keep driving. And every cent of that increase traces back to two decisions: the decision by hostile actors to close the Strait of Hormuz, which no one could control, and the decision by the President of the United States to wage economic war against America's energy lifeline, which one man chose. The first decision was geopolitics. The second was ego, and you are paying for both. Now, let me give you the psychological profile comparison because it explains why Canada holds all the cards and the United States holds nothing. Mark Carney spent his career managing systemic crises. As governor of the Bank of Canada during 2008 and governor of the Bank of England during Brexit, he developed an institutional understanding of how supply shocks, market panics, and structural vulnerabilities create both risk and opportunity. When the U.S.-Canada crisis began, Carney did not respond emotionally. He responded structurally. He identified Canada's vulnerability, dependence on the U.S. as a single energy customer, and he built alternatives. He accelerated the Trans Mountain pipeline utilization. He supported LNG Canada's operational launch. He opened diplomatic channels with Asian and European buyers. Every move was designed to transform a vulnerability into a strength. And the Strait of Hormuz crisis, while not something Carney caused or could have predicted in its specifics, is exactly the type of global supply shock that Carney spent his career preparing for. He built the infrastructure to exploit a disruption. The disruption arrived, and now the infrastructure is paying dividends that exceed anything anyone projected. Trump, by contrast, approached the energy relationship with Canada the way he approaches every relationship, as a zero-sum dominance contest. Canada sells oil to the U.S. at a discount? Good. That means we are winning. Canada has no alternative buyers? Good. That means they cannot leave. Canada depends on American markets? Good. That means we can impose tariffs and they cannot retaliate effectively. Every one of those assumptions was correct 18 months ago. None of them are correct today. Trump's error was treating a structural dependency as permanent when it was only circumstantial. Canada was dependent on U.S. markets because it lacked alternative infrastructure. The moment that infrastructure was built, the dependency ended. And Trump's own tariff policy provided the political motivation for Canada to build that infrastructure faster than anyone anticipated. This is the difference between a leader who thinks in snapshots and a leader who thinks in systems. Trump saw a snapshot, Canada dependent on the U.S., and assumed the snapshot was permanent. Carney saw a system, global energy flows, choke point vulnerabilities, infrastructure timelines, and redesigned the system to eliminate the dependency. The Strait of Hormuz crisis did not create Canada's advantage. It revealed it. The advantage was built over years of infrastructure investment, diplomatic outreach, and strategic planning. The crisis simply made the advantage visible to the entire world at the exact moment when the world most needed what Canada had to offer. Trump brought tariffs to an infrastructure fight, and infrastructure won. Let me give you 3 scenarios for what happens next. Scenario 1, the energy reconciliation. The Strait of Hormuz crisis forces the United States to recognize that maintaining access to Canadian energy is an existential national interest. Trump removes tariffs on Canadian goods, meets Canada's 5 requirements, and negotiates a new energy partnership based on market pricing and mutual respect rather than coerced discounts and dependency. Canadian crude continues flowing to U.S. refineries, but at global market prices rather than the deep discounts of the old arrangement. American consumers pay more than they did before the crisis, but less than they would pay without Canadian supply. The U.S.-Canada relationship is rebuilt on equal terms. The energy partnership survives, but the era of American leverage over Canadian pricing is permanently over. Probability, 25%. This requires Trump to abandon the tariff policy, accept Canada's demands, and acknowledge that the old energy relationship was exploitative. His personality and political incentives make this extremely unlikely without overwhelming institutional pressure. Scenario 2, the permanent pivot. The U.S. does not resolve the crisis with Canada. Canadian energy continues flowing predominantly to Asian and European markets. Long-term contracts with India, Japan, South Korea, and European buyers lock in supply commitments that remove Canadian crude from the American market for years or decades. American refineries in the Midwest and Pacific Northwest either retrofit to process different grades of crude from alternative suppliers at higher cost or reduce output. Gasoline prices in the United States stabilize at levels $0.60 to $1.00 higher than pre-crisis norms. American consumers absorb the cost permanently. The U.S. energy sector restructures around the reality that Canadian discounts are gone and are not coming back. Canada becomes one of the world's most important energy exporters to Asia, rivaling Middle Eastern producers in market share once the strait reopens. The Canadian dollar strengthens. Alberta's economy booms. Canada's geopolitical influence expands dramatically as energy-dependent nations court Canadian supply. Probability, 50%. This is the most likely outcome because it follows the current trajectory and requires no dramatic action from either side. Canada continues building relationships with non-U.S. buyers. The U.S. continues refusing to meet Canada's demands. The market does the rest.